The United States has long been recognized as one of the most violent industrialized nations in the world. The most violent region of the United States is the Southeast. 15 southern states generate 41% of the entire country's violent crime. Of those states, Tennessee has consistently been ranked as one of the most affected by violence. It was the second most violent state in the nation last year, according to the U.S. Peace Index. The Federal Bureau of Investigation reports that street gangs are responsible for an average of 48% of violent crime in most jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions report that up to 90% of violent crime can be traced back to street gangs. The following presentation on youth violence was given by Boyd Patterson, a former delinquent youth counselor, Tennessee prosecutor, and gang task force coordinator.
Join me in welcoming Boyd Patterson.
This is a presentation about one of the things that I think is not really examined a lot. You're talking about youth violence. The title of this is Instinctual Awareness. I say instinct in terms of biology. There's a biological component that I feel is part of, and should be part of the dialogue, and simply becoming aware, just like we're aware of the sex trafficking, just like we're aware of what demographic factors and socioeconomic factors are in play. I think that simply becoming aware of this component can inform a lot of the other things. Now, one of the best sources of wisdom to me is in Scripture. Jude wrote about how some of the cities and the citizens of those cities, if they weren't following a code, they're just acting on their instincts. And it was very self-destructive. So this is something that goes back 2,000 years, and it's rooted in a lot of the things that we see in Scripture as well. Well, I don't know if whether you believe the Bible to the degree that I do or not, here's where I'm coming from for the purposes of this presentation. I do believe three things. That instinct, as we'll talk about it, the biological factors, drives a lot of destructive and self-destructive behavior. I feel that instinct is at its most powerful when it operates outside of our awareness, as policymakers and as individuals as well. And I believe that becoming more aware of these biological mechanisms as they exist helps people choose. They're not driven anymore. So that's what this is about. A lot of this biology, as nurses, may seem like a review to you. Hopefully you'll get something out of how it splices into what I feel needs to be a factor in the dialogue that deals with youth violence. So just bear with me when we get into the biological parts of it that you already may know, and just we'll get to it. Now, I'm going to use the term evolution in this presentation. I want to make sure there's no misunderstanding about where I'm coming from on that. Evolution means a lot to two camps, the Darwinists and those who believe in intelligent design. It deals with the origin of the human species. When it comes to the origin of the human species, the Darwinists and those of us who believe in intelligent design are at completely different odds. As opposed to being designed at some point, the Darwinists believe that we all evolved from the species. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, we talk about evolution. There are two types you need to be aware of. Microevolution is compatible with intelligent design. We do have genes. That is a fact. Those genes do get transmitted from generation to generation to generation. And they do evolve or change. That's not inconsistent with intelligent design. Macroevolution takes it back a little further. You don't have to know all the details between the two. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to stay right there. And the reason is because that's just a biological fact. We do have genes. It's not incompatible with anything. Whatever your beliefs are, you can hold on to them for this presentation. And make sure that's clear before we get started. It's not going to help or hurt either side. This is a fact. Whether you believe it evolved from a creator, whether you believe it evolved from a single life species, that's just a fact. Life evolved through natural selection, where those genes go from generation to generation to generation. And the fittest ones make it into the next generation. So this presentation, think of it as a perspective, as a lens through which you can look at youth violence and see the biological dynamics that are in play. It can help inform a lot of the decisions that get made later. Now, let's look at it in terms of criminal street gangs. They are a problem. The biggest problems that affect us about criminal street gangs, it's kids. Kids are out there getting killed. Teenagers. And kids are the ones that are doing the killing. They're doing over ridiculous things, over colors, over a piece of pavement that they'll never own. And they're dying over slights to respect that won't mean anything to them in 20 years. So it's a big problem. Now, talk about best practices in anti-gang initiatives. That's the model. That's just it, that one slide. Camps typically form in cities into those who believe that they're just kids and need the right opportunities and need to be empowered. The other camp is they commit a crime, lock them up. The truth is you have to have both suppression and outreach. That's just a fact because the bandwidth we're talking about is huge. You have to have specialized law enforcement units. You have to have education. If a kid focuses on just education, that can get him through these years. Jobs actually breaks down into two components. You have to have youth job initiatives where kids get excited about their future. And you have to have reentry work where the gang members coming back from the penitentiary get job skills, get plugged into certain opportunities to keep them straight as well. Community, that means neighborhood. You have to have neighborhoods getting back in connection with one another. You have to have the folks in those neighborhoods starting to communicate. Social services, that was big. That was something that I knew about but didn't really see firsthand until I was working with the task force. You can't talk to a kid about changing his life around if he's worried about where he's going to eat that night. Clean clothes is a big thing. A lot of people don't even have washers and dryers. One of the best outreach initiatives in town, YCAP, Joe Smith uses the washer and dryer. When the kid gets dropped off, he tells the parents, you know, once you bring a load of laundry to, well, guess what? Joe Smith's got them for a couple hours to work on them too while they're doing that laundry because it's a necessity. Family's a big component. Who here thinks that the breakdown of the family contributes to gang membership? A lot of folks. I do too. A lot of the folks we do see, gang members, don't have a real relationship with their dad. Their mother's unavailable for whatever reason. Think about this. In the Hispanic community, typically, frequently anyway, the mother and father are both still in the home, but typically very hardworking, good role models. Layers of family support, aunts, uncles, cousins. Religion is huge in the Hispanic culture. They've got some of the most violent gangs on the planet. So family's important, but something about gang membership when it comes to youth trumps even that. That's big. Mentorships is big. You have to have mentorships that go at least 6 months. Research shows that 6 months or less is absolutely detrimental to kids because that bond of trust, once broken, it's harder to reestablish later. So you have to have that at least 6 months. And of course the faith component is big. The faith community, if they came together on this, could really make strides. Well, you put them all together and you get some of the kids migrating through those programs away from street gangs. We have all this data, all these resources, more than ever, all these knowledge about programs. However, the FBI showed that between 2005 and 2009, the approximate number of gang members in the United States went from approximately 1 million to approximately 1.4 million. The TBI released a report that showed that across the state of Tennessee from 2005 to 2011, gang activity has doubled. In towns and populations of 50,000 or less, gang activity actually tripled in that same time period. And of course, the Chattanooga Gang Assessment also reflected that. So it's blowing up. locally, across the state, across the nation. If we know all this, if this is the best model that's out there, if we're throwing everything at it, what's the issue? Here's my argument to you. Biology is a component. It's not the answer, but it's a component. A component that's largely missing from the discussion. And here's the insight. We're talking about that lens we're talking about earlier. We're simply observing biological mechanisms that are already in place. They're already operating as human beings. And we'll talk about those. We're simply bringing them into awareness so we can make more informed decisions. One of those mechanisms deals with the prefrontal cortex. That's part of our brain. Its mechanism deals with executive functioning, which means how do we make decisions? What's a good choice or a bad choice? Now, that is something that deals with judgment. And the research shows, biological research shows that that is not developed until the 20s. The earliest I found was 21. The Yale study showed that I think it was, or Oxford showed that it was between 25 and 30. In your case, it's one of the last to develop. When's puberty start? How many have teenage kids? Been around teenagers, all right. 10 to 14. That's when it happens. That's almost a decade of all gas pedal, no brake. Imagine teenagers trying to drive cars and they don't get brakes until they're 21 or 22, because that's what's happening to them. That's a biological fact. And we know that anecdotally. We have a juvenile justice system that's different, but a lot of people don't know that. You can look at studies that show what happens to adults with damages to their prefrontal cortex. They suddenly have less control of their signals from the limbic system. That's a seat of some of our deepest emotions. They're risk takers. They break rules. They lose their self-control. They can't modify or inhibit their behavior, become more immature, exercise horrible social judgment. They lose their intellectual flexibility. That tells you what's going on with that. Biological fact. So there's no real surprise about the age-crime correlation. One of the biggest correlates to crime is age. This shows where typically criminal behavior starts right around puberty, that age, peaks in the mid to late teens, then starts tapering off. It's called the inverted J, and you can Google it if you want to. It's something that is understood as fact by every criminologist on the planet. Matter of fact, when I Googled to figure out which one of these charts I was going to use, I decided, you know what, I'm going to use this in the presentation. Which one of these inverted J's to show the spike did you want to look at? Got the FBI one, the one from Florida State, Oxford. It's just a fact. So, you have poor self-control as youth, biologically speaking. Let's talk now about instinct. What plays heavily into it, since we don't have that executive functioning developed yet. Instincts keep us alive. It keeps these kids alive in harsh environments. They don't learn how to hustle to get money from school. They got to figure that out. They don't learn they have to change different ways that they get to and from their house to just stay alive. They figure that out. Instinct is something in a biological sense. We're going to break it down even more than that. That's the scientific definition of instinct. I'm going to read it to you. We're going to talk about 5 different parts of it. Instinct's an inherited tendency of an organism to behave in a certain way, usually in reaction to its environment, for the purpose of fulfilling a specific need. Instinctive behavior develops in the same way for all individuals of a species when the same sex of a species. Again, I'm keeping this straight biology as much as I can. Everything you're going to hear today is either going to be biological fact or based on biological fact. 5 things we're going to talk about. Instinct, it's inherited. It works with what we learn, but there's a component of that's inherited. It's a tendency. It's not a mandate. You're not driven. It's not an irresistible thing, but you have that push for these instincts. Excuse me. It's in reaction to the environment. There are environmental cues that trigger instincts. It's purposeful. Meaning it's strategic. It helps you achieve something. It's a drive. It happens with all individuals of the same species or the same sex of the species. The takeaway from this is it's a species-wide thing. It's not a black thing. It's not a white thing, Hispanic thing, Asian thing. It's a human thing. Now, underline that last part of that sentence too, same sex of the species, because one of the other stronger correlates of crime, to crime, besides age, is gender. Overwhelmingly, it's male. That's the way it is, especially the violent crime. Some other things about instinct, it's complex. Unlike shining the light to a patient's eye where the pupil constricts, that's a simple reaction. Complex, that's when birds fly south for the winter, wolves learn how to hunt in packs, we feel safe or unsafe, certain environmental cues, that's a fact. Those environmental cues trigger those instincts which we experience as feelings, they push us towards certain actions. Neurotransmitters, of course, get released. The feel-good serotonin, the reward-seeking dopamine, the adrenal norepinephrine, and it pushes us towards a fight, flight, or freeze response typically. Again, it's a fact. Now, these are historical facts. They're foundational because they describe when we get into what goes on in youth violence in these harsh environments. Okay? Fact one, and I hope I don't have to convince a room full of nurses of this, but we are biological creatures. There's a biological component to everything we do. Part of that is this fundamental drive for survival. We have it. About 3 months ago, a lady who was apparently feeling down about herself, down about her life, had some setbacks, back in February, decided to jump off the Walnut Street Bridge. You may remember hearing about it, to kill herself. Well, 2 seconds after she hits the water in February, she realized that's not a good idea. And that drive to survive kicks in. They found her 2,000 feet downstream, clinging to the rigging of a passing barge, screaming to be saved. Again, bringing these things into awareness, what I'm talking about. I hope you don't ever have to step off the bridge to understand that you're valuable and need to live. But we're talking about some of these things that these kids are dealing with, how it's out of their awareness too. More specifically, we have this drive for genetic survival. It's our genes. We sacrifice for our kids. That's an instinctive response. That's something that we just have. It's part of that. We have, as part of being a biological creature, these wonderful biological mechanisms that you guys have studied about to keep us alive. We have blood, bones, skin, complete organ system, circulatory system, nervous system, digestive system, lymph system. Those all keep us alive. And this is the review part of it for you guys. As you know, every single one of those mechanisms have a genetic basis, genotype. Well, the outward manifestation of this is a phenotype, the actual expression of that. Again, it's just a fact. Some phenotypes are more fit than others, which means that, number two, natural selection. The fittest genes just survive more often. Again, biological fact. Blood that actually clots, bones that reconnect when they're broken, skin that protects from infection, those things help us on that fitness drive, that drive for genetic survival. Those are the ones that make it. Again, natural selection affects all biology, not just us, every mammal, every creature. Key concept. It's the environment that defines fitness. Picture that barrier there is the environment, certain challenges, certain things that are present in the environment. Those can be different phenotypes that have different types of expressions. Well, some of them don't make it through the environment. Typically speaking, blood that doesn't clot, other things like that. They're just disadvantages. While we have those, primarily the ones that make it through are the ones that are conducive to fitness. And as from generation those genes progress, they tend to get more frequent. They're not the ones that get weeded out. So, those genetic expressions at some point can take over, if you go long enough, they take over the entire genetic makeup. It's very consistent. It goes throughout the species. And that is why, in the textbooks that you study, It's down to the nth level of degree. You know exactly how these mechanisms work. It's consistent across human beings. That's just what that is. Those are the fittest genes that have survived. And we all have them now. Part 3. Instincts have this genetic basis. That's the definition of instinct. It's inherited. You don't teach these things. These things, this drive to stay alive, and the specific, more specific instincts, which we'll get to in a few more slides. That's shown by twin studies, monozygotic and dizygotic twins. They're spread out. When it comes to criminal behavior, there's a high correlation. When you put these twins in different environments, there's a genetic component to that. Adoption studies, one of the biggest ones done, I think in the 80s when it was published, looked at almost 14,000 adoptions. And the kids who ended up most likely to be criminals were the ones who had biological criminal parents and were placed with foster homes where the parents were criminal as well. Well, the second greatest were the ones who had biological parents who were criminals and the ones who were placed in non-criminal environments, which shows there's this genetic component. Again, it's a component. That's what I want to communicate. It's not determinative. It's maybe not even the biggest thing. My point to you today is biology is not part of the discussion. It's obviously part of the instinct. And since it has a genetic basis, it's clear. The genes for the fittest instinctual drives also make it through some other, and we'll get into those specifics in just a second. But again, think of feelings, these instincts as strategies, things that help you live. They're purposeful. They get your genes in the next generation. Like all other genes, they're shaped by the environmental conditions. The environment defines the genes that make it, including instincts. So, those instincts have gone through, which we all have. All of us. What are they? Well, answer that question is another question. What were those consistent aspects of the ancestral environment? We didn't always have policemen, and prosecutors, refrigerators, and grocery stores and hospitals. As a species, we were hunter-gatherers, small groups. That environment was violent, lawless, very scarce resources. Lifespan was very short. You were 35-year-old back then. You needed the group to survive. You didn't make it very long on your own. Basically, within the group, you had to compete. You pretty much handled your own business. No one's going to do something for you. That's a biological fact of where we came from. The instincts that make sense coming from that, things that we all have, deal with acquiring safety, acquiring sex, children, nurturing children, our own children, acquiring resources, to cooperate within a group, seeking power within that group, and at the very least getting status or respect, and instincts that deal with threats to those. Those instincts were the difference between life and death back then. And so, you have that type of environment, obviously leads to those type of instincts that we all have. I put up here, I could have picked anything. I picked the 7 deadly sins as examples of antisocial behavior taken to an extreme. But you can see where greed is obviously connected to acquiring resources, lust, acquiring sex, anger, acquiring the resources and power, pride, status and respect, even gluttony and sloth, calorie-rich food. There's no good reason that we love cheesecake, or I love cheesecake. It's positively detrimental to my health. But the reason, you put a piece in front of me, it's, your mouth starts to water. It's that calorie-rich food. That is a fact. And it fits in with all those other instincts that kept us alive when calories weren't so frequent. So those instincts, once they proliferate and make it through the entire species of humanity, we have those in 2013. Now, all those are biological facts. Let's look at that, where we are today. The environmental cues that trigger those instincts Our environmental cues of violence, lawlessness, scarcity of resources, short lifespan, where you need a group to survive and handle your business. Seemed kind of like the prior presentation, what Ken was talking about. Certain areas of town that are impoverished. Inner city, it's El Salvador. It's a trailer park, South Central Los Angeles. Guess what happens? What happens automatically? What happens naturally, organically, when you put kids in an impoverished situation with those types of environments? You have gangs. You've got our local Crips there. It's MS-13. Aryan Brotherhood. The Asian Boys, a hyper-violent gang out of Los Angeles. Key concept. This is not a black thing. It's not a white thing. It's not a Hispanic thing. It's not an Asian thing. It is a human thing. We all have that. People living on Signal Mountain, people living out on Lookout Mountain, out of the inner city, they have those same instincts. You put them in the same impoverished situation, they'll have those same tendencies. Biological fact. So, again, it's a component. It's not the answer. It's part of the answer. It's part of the solution. I feel it needs to be factored in to those others, at least as part of the discussion. Why? We're talking about causation here. About what causes a lot of this. Helps meet at-risk kids where they actually are and the feelings that they're actually experiencing. Those existing programs can be improved. You can actually use those natural dynamics too. Big one right there. You figure out a way to get at-risk kids feeling like they're respected, feeling that they've gained status in some way. That's different than saying stay away from gangs, stay away from drugs. You're using those natural dynamics to get them to something very positive. So, why is gang activity increasing? We looked at it earlier, locally, across the state, across the nation. Well, I do know this. Gang membership flips all those instinctual switches, every one of them. It's still largely missing from the discussion. One thing, too, about instinct, it's important to know. It supersedes rational thought. It kind of proves what we're talking about. So, you're afraid of violence. I'm talking to a 14-year-old kid here. You're afraid of violence. You don't want to get hurt. So you decide to join a gang where you're putting yourself in contact with folks who inflict and draw violence of all the kind. You just increased your rate exponentially of meeting a violent death. You join a gang. That doesn't make sense until you look at it with this particular perspective through this lens. You can look at other youth violence concepts too. Commit suicide after being bullied? That's horrible. Again, it makes no sense. Life obviously goes on past high school, goes on way past high school. It's not even the most important part of your life until you look at it in those terms, where we came from, the lifespan was very short. Those hierarchies that started as soon as we become able to reproduce, as soon as puberty hits, those defined where we were, y'all. Lifespan was short. It was catastrophic to be at the bottom of that particular pecking order. Again, it makes no sense for youth to commit suicide unless you look at it through this lens. To commit school shootings after being bullied? How many kids who've done this have looked at documentaries on other school shooters and go, wow, those kids who just took out all the people who were bullying them, their lives have gotten so much better now. Doesn't happen. You know that doesn't happen. It makes no sense to commit these. Their life's not going to get better, but it happens all the time. And I'm arguing to you that the biological component is in play there. That's something where if you look at it through this perspective, suddenly it makes sense. To bully in the first place, again, to get that status on the hierarchy, it only makes sense in this. And you can look at other things too, those other instincts. How many spectacular political crashes have come from an affair that makes no sense? General Petraeus is the most recent example. That guy was the head of the CIA. He knew that any type of sexual affair was positively detrimental to our national security. Because as soon as it happens, resources have to get diverted to figure out, okay, what could possibly have been divulged, who knew what, and all that, and that puts lives at risk. He did it. Makes no sense. You think he wanted to be booted out, to be remembered by the 60 years of his life, a disgraceful particular episode? That's where we are. And he's had enough cautionary tales to know that's what's going to happen. Happened anyway. Makes no sense unless you look at things through this. So, back to those three things. I really think that increasing awareness to service providers, to folks who are in a position to understand and see this up close, can really inform a lot of their decisions, a lot of their programs, can also help the actual folks themselves. I feel that self-awareness, these dynamics, can be achieved. Again, going back to Scripture there. Paul wrote pretty much the New Testament. He struggled with it. He didn't understand. One of the most dialed-in Christians in history wrote how he doesn't understand his own actions. He doesn't do what he wants to do. But the stuff that he doesn't want to do, that he does. Again, source of wisdom for this. And self-awareness. So, what's that look like through the lens? I want you to, this may seem like a stretch to you, so I want you to go with me and then we'll come back around and I'll be able to explain a little more. Imagine a 17-year-old kid who's getting pressured by his gang members to commit a retaliatory shooting after some of their gang members were shot and killed. Okay? So just imagine the type of self-awareness that ideally could be present. And then I'll argue to you that I think it can be actually done, though it may seem like a stretch at the beginning. First, imagine that kid could become more self-aware of his own feelings. Doesn't run from them, doesn't react to them, doesn't go with the push. Yeah, they shot us up, give me the gun, let's go. Became aware of them. Anger, fear, resentment, all that. Was able to label them. Imagine that kid was able to see the environmental connection to that feeling. These feelings that we have, they're in that framework of instinct from environmental cue. Putting it in that framework allows it to become less driving. It's more mechanistic that way. Oh, I see. Switch get hit over here, light pops on over there. To be able to see that context, which diminishes the driving nature of it. Become more self-aware of the action that the feeling pushes them towards. It pushes me towards retaliating, demonstrating our respect that we need. It's the fear of losing that respect if we don't retaliate. Imagine the kid being aware of how those actions or equivalents of those actions would have been helpful in that ancestral environment. About how you had to retaliate. You had to stick up for your group. Otherwise, you got exploited. It was only self-help back then. You had to do it. What if a person could be self-aware of that? This is huge. Those instincts we talked about. Sex, power, community, all of those things, all those instincts, they serve that more fundamental drive. You don't retaliate for retaliation's sake. You do it because it's connected to that fundamental drive. You had to do it to keep your genes alive, to keep you alive. Again, that takes it away from this driving response. You understand that more fundamental drive. And I hope these kids, again, don't have to jump off a bridge to get in touch with that self-respect. How they want to stay alive. They need to stay alive. That's one of the most fundamental biological characteristics about themselves. How do you get them more in touch with that? Imagine they were in touch with that. Imagine when that retaliation happened. They're getting pressured by all their friends. That they were in touch with that drive to stay alive. Well, they got killed, but he got killed because he kind of dissed them. What do you think they're going to do? Who's going to, does it make sense for me to jump on that, to put a target on myself? The police see that the Crips get shot up. Who do you think, what gang do you think will be looking for to be doing something? Who's going to be under the microscope? It doesn't make sense for me to do this. And that would lead to that kid hopefully seeing all the options that are available to them in the current environment. And keep the retaliation on the table. Don't run away from it. Don't run towards it. Look at it what it is. Look at it as an option. Again, takes it out of that driving space, driving nature. Look at it. Does it make sense to retaliate? Does it make sense to not? Make sense to lay low? Does it make sense to get out of a gang? Make sense to leave this behind me? That's what makes sense. Imagine that most beneficial option emerging, that kid being aware of it. Imagine as he's leaving the gang, he sees, he's feeling, he understands, it's connected, that biological process that's already operating in all of us 24/7, connecting it to that action, leaving the gang, and all the feelings that come with that. This is what's best for me. And afterwards, being glad that you did. Being aware, increasing that awareness that this is what is best. Now, who here has ever taught inner city youth anything? No one? I have. Who here thinks that it might be difficult to teach kids from impoverished environments esoteric concepts like this?
I think it's difficult teaching teenagers that, period, no matter where they're from.
It is difficult. Here's my argument on why I think it can be done. Again, we're talking about things that already exist. They're already going on. They already feel these feelings. They're already in response to environmental cues. They're already out of touch with their own desire to live, their own self-respect. Something that's already there. We're simply bringing them into awareness. I think that if you increase the self-awareness of these concepts, these youth violence episodes, they're no longer driven. People can be able to choose. And this isn't just youth violence. I mean, we're talking about something that has application to lots of different settings. This deals with us too. This doesn't exclude anybody. But in this particular setting, it allows us to choose over the instincts, even though I probably still will have the cheesecake today. So, all right? But you can choose. And we'll finish up with this. It's an exercise. And I hope you see that this is something, whether you get this or not, this next part, that this is something that is species-wide. It's not a race thing. It's a human thing. We all have it, including me, including everyone sitting in this room. So I want you to think about something. I want you to think about something that would evoke a strong emotional response, perhaps along the lines of those 7 deadly sins we started. We certainly had enough examples shown to us in the media of prideful people, of what happens, spectacular self-destructive behavior due to lust, greed, gluttony, envy, wrath, sloth. Again, I could have picked a lot of these. I just chose these because they're common. So think about this for a second. Think about your own lives in terms of those instincts, those positive instincts. I say positive, things that we all have. Think about a time when status meant a lot to you. Maybe it still does. Or sex, money, wealth meaning the acquiring things, comfort, respect, and power. I want you to think of a time in your life on that, okay? Think of an episode where you might have been in that space. And think about it. I want you to remember who was there. Who are you competing with? What was the threat to you? What is the threat to you? What's a threat you never want to experience? Think of that feeling. Think of the images. And then realize and see, what is the environmental cue? What's going on? What caused you to feel that way? What is the connection between your feeling that you have associated with that and the environment? What's the flip switch that turned on the light inside of you? It's there. What action does that feeling drive you to take? To stick up for yourself, to stick up for someone else, to respond, to protect somebody, protect yourself maybe. See how that would have been helpful in the ancestral environment. What did that protect when there was no one else? You're taught certain things. I'm not saying do it. What does it push you to do? What's that instinct driving you? What's that emotion? What action is it? And I hope you see that that instinct that you're feeling, that feeling, is connected to that ancestral environment, and that it's subordinate to something that's more fundamental about yourself. You have this drive to stay alive. You have this the seed of your self-respect. That drive that you have doesn't exist on its own. It drives to keep you alive. So think of that in terms of what other options would be available with a rival. Do you really want to punch him in the face? Do you really want to retaliate? Do you want to do something that's self-destructive? Aren't there other options that are out there that can better serve that fundamental drive? Of course there are. And when you emerge from that, and when you see that, and think about it next time you have a feeling, next time you have something like that, look for that environmental cue. Look for that connection, the ancestral environment, and become more aware that there's something more powerful operating there. As nurses, you can also become more aware of just the biology of this, of what's existing. It's already there, these biological facts that support it. The last one is that, again, this is shared. Natural selection hits every biological creature. We all have this. I love to walk in the woods. I know a lot of people do too. You feel more connected with nature. This is something that connects everybody together, across races. So that's instinctual awareness, becoming aware of the feelings as policymakers. Again, I'll finish with this. This isn't to try to convince anybody of any esoteric belief that has no application. I'm coming at this with over 15 years, approximately 15 years, being in the criminal justice system, of seeing these kids operate, of seeing instinct drive horribly destructive decisions, and hoping that becoming more aware of these as people, as policymakers, we can incorporate that into certain programs as a component. Not the end-all, be-all, maybe not the most important one even. It's missing from the discussion now. Any questions?
Generally, all I can say is, wow, I have not heard this perspective. No, and it's a unique perspective. And look at everything, all the resources we draw out and just throw at it, and I've never heard this quite like this before.
Here's where it's going to happen. People are going to realize it. It's going to go out of the concept of a theory when people are able to see that that's what we all have. The next time you have a strong feeling, think of any emotional feeling that you've had before in your life that's extreme and take it through those steps. Identifying it, seeing the environmental trigger that hit it, seeing how the action would have been helpful in an ancestral environment, but becoming more aware that we're not there anymore. That's a hangover. But that's why kids are killing each other over colors, over territory that might have been something a long time ago. It doesn't anymore. They're dying over this, over disrespect. Makes no sense until you look at it through this lens. Yes, ma'am.
So in your current job, will you still be able to work somehow with this?
That's still up in the air. You know, again, I was a counselor before I was a lawyer, and I was a prosecutor for a long time. Been in law enforcement more than anything else. But where does all this come together? Where can we actually work with the kids the most? And so I asked to go to juvenile court, and so far that's where I am. So we'll see how, and not just this, but other things too. We can start, getting more data-driven, biologically based, or at least informed ways to deal with some of the youth violence. Yes, ma'am.
What age group did you think, would be the most beneficial, like to target, once they're you know, what, 25 or 30, you know, are they beyond help? Do you start when they're 10 or 12? I mean, what kind of age group would be the...
Age is key. I take that back. Age is critical. Anybody can change at any time. Again, this is a component, but environment's a big thing too. So what I'm saying is that adults can come out of prison at 35 and 40 and change their life. The earlier you get them, the better. The key ages to think about in terms of for this material is puberty. When puberty hits, that's when everything else hits. That's when naturally we gravitate away from our parents, whatever that parental structure happens to be, towards our peer group. All those things suddenly become important. We don't have the brakes though. So it depends on what initiative you're talking about. You can do intervention with teens, you can do prevention with young kids, you can do reentry with older adults.
Doesn't the very condition of their prefrontal cortex make their ability to understand and carry this out?
Yes, it does. It absolutely does. Again, it's a challenge. I think the point is, yes, we know the answer, but the fact that they're going through this brain growth makes it even more difficult than it would be ordinarily to teach someone, right? Absolutely. But again, my hope is that this is stuff that's going on right now with all of us on the planet. So it's not a matter of getting to understand, third-dimensional vectors or high-level algebra or anything like that. Just understanding the feelings that we know they're having. And they're making very self-destructive decisions based on. So I think it's possible. Yes, you and then you.
I have a question. If a child is brought up with a safe environment as a child, would they act more rationally when they're teenagers?
Yes.
More than the instinct?
Again, there are exceptions to everything we're talking about. There's many exceptions as there are humans on the planet. Generally speaking, absolutely. There's a biological component, but there's also an environmental component as well. Obviously, the fact that we're able to change and grow and learn things and turn our lives around, that is possible. And the environment that we're brought up in forms that initial structure. So when puberty does hit, that type of rebellion might be, hey, I'm going to sneak out after midnight, versus, hey, okay, I'll hold the gun to the cashier's head while you drive the getaway car. So yes, it's relative, but it is possible for that. It is, yes, a strong environmental background in the family or the church or wherever can help inoculate a kid against extreme violence. And I think you had a question too.
Okay, so if you're back to the 14-year-old and the retaliation, so you're saying that you want to show them to have a different choice of survival, I guess, is what I understood you were saying. But for kids, I guess we can tell them, I mean, they're not stupid. We can tell them all day long that if they choose to not retaliate and maybe lay low or get out of the game, then their chance of survival is so much higher that we can tell them that all day long, but they're going to say, prove it, show me. Because what they see every day is that is their only choice, and that does what works.
Well, that's what everybody's doing, and those are the instinctual drives. And I think every kid, and you talk to gang members themselves, and Ken and I talked to a lot of them the last year and a half, they'll tell you gang membership's a dead end. They'll tell you that. They know that cognitively. But you put them in the right situation where the group is going a certain way, they're going to make those irrational decisions. So yes, it's something that we can tell them that. The absolute, and I'll say this too, again, I can talk to you all day on initiatives I think work. One of the best ones, the guys who have their PhD in street survival skills, those returning felons, those aged out gang members, those are the ones you want to get in front of the kids. Because we can tell them all this. We can find ways to show them all this, get them to feel all this. But when a person who can say, listen, I've been there, I've done that, I've made the mistakes, and you can trust me that this is not the way to go. And that's the best way to make the connection.
Yeah, because they've been, well, I don't say playing a game, because they've been let down by, so many other people and environments. And so why should they trust, why should they trust someone else telling them you could have a better life? Well,
and again, that's where we're going from. Again, this component that we're talking about today is what's operating. If that's there, if we know that someone giving them a rational explanation on why they don't need to get high in the basement that day with their friends versus the peer pressure and needing to belong to that group is going to trump that, not 9 times out of 10, but like 99 times out of 100. Absolutely. So I'm not saying it's going to solve everything. What I'm saying is it helps make things more informed. At the very least, it lets us know what we're up against. It's hard. It's impossible. So don't get discouraged. When you do talk to them 100 times and 99 times they don't listen to you, well, maybe they will that 100th time. Yes, ma'am.
Seems like they're always struggling with control, trying to get control, but they feel like they're out of control. And with, you talked about the Hispanic culture. I grew up in California, so I grew up close with that type of culture. With the father being the head of the household and the faith being really strong and the mom having her role, the kids who hit puberty don't have a role. I think they struggle with identity and where they fit in and gaining control of themselves and their feelings and their emotions. So back to biology, I feel like it doesn't matter who you are or where you live or what family you come from, poverty or money or whatever, crime is there from the bottom to the top. And I just feel like I've never addressed empowering these children and helping them find control.
Yes. Think about it in terms of historical context again. Right. When puberty hits, that's when who you are with that particular group of hunter-gatherers gets defined. It's imperative they find out who they are right then. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of hard study hard for 10 years, read the books in the library, don't do anything really scintillating or interesting, and I promise in 10 years you won't regret it, versus, you want to sneak out tonight? We'll leave. You'll be back in the house in 2 hours with $100 in your pocket. That doesn't compete.
It's like they don't have a role. It seems like in families these days. And like I said, it doesn't matter where you come from. And it helps with outreach programs in church and schools that have good programs, but in a community like ours, and there's some money, and there's minimum programs, but kids don't have a role.
And you think about terms, that's
in their
important.
family or their community. So they find a place where they fit in, where they have a duty, where they have control, and they have a job. And these days they have a purpose.
Absolutely.
Even if it's not what we want them to have.
But it hits that instinctual need for, I've got a purpose, I've got money tonight. And what I'm saying is that the vacuum of putting something off for 10 years that exists versus the only thing that's left at that point is what's immediate in gratification. If you recall that crime spike, that's what draws the kids to that risky, risky behavior of all kinds. So.
I think also, kind of fitting in with what she said, kids that grow up in the inner city don't seem to have as much options maybe as kids that are growing up in the country who are getting exposed to 4-H and things like that, where they can kind of assert their identity. Whereas in the inner city, it's like, where do you build a garden? Where are the jobs for the teenagers? I mean, it must be a horrible struggle, I would think, to be able to find a positive identity when you have so few options.
Absolutely. It's one of the reasons mentorships work so well. You got to have leftover $100, $200, $300 at the end of the year. You want to donate to somewhere. Boys Club, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Girls Inc., Goodwill, their mentoring program. That works. Because again, it's not someone telling them anything. It's, hey, come with me. And everything you're doing at that point, whether you're telling them anything, you are showing them what it's like to be a positive person. Last I heard, there were 130 some odd kids on the waiting list just for Big Brothers, Big Sisters. Some have been there for over a year. So think about that for a second. Think about what it takes for a kid to know, to admit some type of weakness. Okay, I guess I need a mentor. And then not get one for over a year. Maybe not get one ever. that's why it's so important to support a lot of those initiatives, especially mentoring.